Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks for those online as well. It is my pleasure to introduce a fellow Brazilian researcher, Dr. Adriane Esquivel Muelbert, correct, who leads the Global Change Ecology Group at the University of Cambridge. Adriane is a leading voice in tropical forest ecology, or global forest ecology, actually, some northern hemisphere too, focusing on how forests live, die, and adapt to global environmental change, and how these large-scale climate pressures are reshaping forest resilience. We're incredibly happy to have you here today. And just a quick reminder that we have drinks after her talk so that we can keep on talking. You go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be here as well. It's always good to come back and talk to you guys. So I'm going to jump straight to this photo, which is in the south of the Amazon. So this is the state of Mato Grosso. It's the transition between the Amazon and the Cerrado. But as you can see in the photo now, this region becomes more the transition between the Amazon and the agriculture frontier of Brazil. And this is a massive area, actually. If you look, this is a photo from a drone, but also across the whole landscape, you see a very similar pattern. These are areas, the extent of this is something like 500,000 square kilometers. So it's over just over 2 times the size of the UK. And this is where land extraction, forest extraction that started in the 70s and then peak around the 80s and 90s, changed the landscape. And with that, it changed also local climatic conditions. So we have nowadays a system that is living beyond what evolved with, adapted to, sorry. So this ecosystem is surviving beyond the limits that has been adapted to, with changes in the landscape leading, accelerating the changes in climate and making temperatures much hotter than they would be otherwise. So, but I want to highlight here this word, the word surviving, because we tend to document the tragedy, but also we also see a lot of resilience here. And as an ecologist, myself and maybe many of you guys, we spend a lot of our time documenting a lot of the changes that we've seen in the world, and a lot of the decline in function and diversity. But also, as we do that, we also record a lot of the resilience and adaptation of the systems. And we've, in the last few years, reflecting with a group of artists. So I started to reflect on how we can also pay more attention to that resilience. And this is what I'm going to kind of frame my talk within this idea of the spiral of work of that reconnects. So this is based on Joanna Macy's work. But in this is adapted by a project that we had funded by the UK Treescapes, the Membra project, where I was introduced to this spiral of this spiral of hope by the collective Walking Forest, which is a art collective that worked with us through this project and really challenged us on our understanding of our science and also understanding of our connections to the natural world. So I want to show here the signs of change that we see, but also the signs of resilience and the signs of vulnerability and hope. And I'm going to do that through three different studies and three different groups of studies. And I'll start with looking at the Amazon, looking at the Amazonia in transition. So a lot of my work has been in the Amazon region, and not just because I'm from Brazil, but because the system is an extremely fascinating and important system. The Amazon stores around 150 to 200 gigatons of carbon. It's also very important, not just for storing carbon, but as a carbon sink. So around 12% of the terrestrial carbon sink, it's done by this amazing forest in the Amazon. And also it's a system that is extremely diverse. So there is a debate there, but we have between 6,000 and 16,000 tree species. And you can find up to 300 species in 1 hectare of forest in the Amazon. Also, it's a region of diverse cultures. We have 47 million people living in the Amazon and 410 indigenous groups and different languages and cultures within those groups. So within the Amazon, we are lucky to have a huge collaborative network, the Rainforest Network, which have been monitoring the Amazon for many years. And that allows us, so what they do is measure trees and then come back to the same place again and again and understand how these trees are living and dying and how the system is changing in terms of species and also in terms of carbon. So what I'm going to show now is a little bit of the results from this huge network of people. And one of the results can be summarized in this paper that is quite outdated now. It's from 2015, but it's the paper that shows us about the dynamics of the Amazon over time. And what you can see here is the net biomass change in the y-axis, and basically the difference between growth and mortality within a system. If this net biomass change is equal 0, means that the system is in equilibrium. We have the same amount of carbon coming into the system and leaving the system. But if the system is above 0, if the line is above 0, we have a carbon sink where you have more growth and recruitment than mortality. And then if you have more mortality than growth and recruitment, we have then a carbon source. And what we find for the Amazon currently, well, in 2015 at least, is that we have the Amazon working as a carbon sink, but you have this line declining over time. And the capacity of the Amazon to absorb carbon is declining, and has been declining from 85 to 2010. And this is driven by an increasing mortality rate. So mortality across the Amazon has been increasing. And you can see that you see a kind of a trajectory of growth, but also in mortality, but you see peaks in this trend, and these peaks coincide with droughts in Amazonia. So you have the 97 El Nino drought, and then you have in 2005, one of the drought that was considered the biggest drought in the last 100 years. And then in 2010, you also had, again, a big drought. And then it was followed by a drought in 2015 with the El Nino, where this work by Amy Bennett and Tayane Souza show a decline in the carbon sink capacity across the Amazon, with the Amazon working, the mortality rates increasing across Amazonia, and then this is comparing before and during the El Nino, and you see that the net carbon change is equal 0 here, so meaning that the service of carbon sink that the Amazon provides shut down during the El Nino in 2015. And this is because in the El Nino 2015, we had a dry year, but also extremely hot. And that led to increased mortality of trees. And this is something that we've been observing in the Amazon again and again. So we have this combination of stresses. We have aridity, then the increase in aridity also favor lianas, which are these woody vines that you can see here. So you have an increasing liana load, and then the increasing liana load can lead to crown breakage that creates a system that is more and more dynamic. You then have a greater mortality rates of trees, and that create more gaps, changes the microclimate, like you have gaps like this one in the photo, and that changes the microclimate in the forest, allows for this forest to be even hotter, and then in a way accelerates the system, creating this positive feedback where you have more lianas, greater mortality, and then you select for fast-growing species that do better at these gaps. And then you have this feedback where a degraded forest will lead to then well, you have warming that in droughts that lead to a degraded forest that will lead to opportunistic plants, and that will feed back into this degraded forest system. And you also, with that, you have deforestation accelerating often in the dry years where it's easier to access the forest. And you also have the increasing fires, which spread easily in the dry years as well. And you have the system of Amazonian transition. And this is the part of the negative part of this story. But also this is happening this is being observed across the Amazon, but we asked ourselves whether it's pervasive across the Amazon or is concentrated in a few regions. And by looking at the data from mortality change across the Amazon, we found that actually while mortality jump in the south of the Amazon, so this region in the frontier of deforestation, this region in where there is this interaction between deforestation and climate change, we have a big jump in mortality. In the other regions, when you divide before and after 2005, we don't see much difference. So, and here is whether you have trends for each of the sites and whether these trends are different from zero or not. So you only see these big increases in the south of the Amazon, meaning that in the other regions, they're potentially not being affected so strongly by climate change, or they have been quite resilient in these other sites as well. So this is a little bit of hope. Although we have a scenario that is quite negative in the south of the Amazon, we see quite a lot of resilience in the other sites. Also, these systems, as a consequence of climate change, they have been changing internally too. So we show that, for instance, if you look over time and you look at what trees are recruiting across the Amazon, so the new trees that are coming in, they tend to be more dry affiliated than the communities that used to be before. So you have a selection of trees that are more adapted to these drought conditions. So the system itself is adapting to change. And we use this information of water deficit affiliation, which is a characteristic of, well, it's information from the distribution of the plants that allow us to tell whether they're more or less adapted to drought. In a program together with funded by the Serra Pilheira Institute to understand which trees should we plant where. So this is a project ongoing, but we use the list of species generated from these several papers where we try to understand the affiliation of species to different conditions to decide which trees to plant where across this area, which is called traditionally the arc of deforestation. Now people are trying to rebrand it to the arc of restoration in the south of the Amazon. The second story, it's about understanding tree mortality, and I go back to tree mortality again because that's the part of the dynamics I've been mostly focusing over time. And it's a very important process and a process that is driving a lot of change in forests. And we see tree mortality increasing across time, across different biomes. So this is one review that show a few sites where tree mortality is increasing. But we really like an understanding, a systematic understanding of the baseline tree mortality and how tree mortality is changing over time. Tree mortality is quite a difficult process to understand because it's quite stochastic. And this is a paper from 2016, but still, like, models, they don't do very well on understanding tree mortality. So here you have observations. So you have above ground biomass loss, and you have here the stem mortality. So these are two different ways of estimating mortality, and these are 4 different dynamic vegetation models trying to predict mortality for the Amazon basin. And you can see that none of the models, they do very well on predicting mortality change. And this is because it's a process that it's quite hard to parameterize and even estimate the rates themselves. So these are just 2 different ways that the trees can die. So you can see this standing that tree here. It could be caused by lightning or drought or a pathogen. And And this is how it looks like if you zoom in. And here you can see another big death event of potentially a tree that died killed by wind. And the rates are quite low, and they vary quite significantly across, for instance, the Amazon basin. So the how and why trees die across the Amazon varies significantly. In the south here, we have high mortality rates, in the west as well. But the way they die, it's in the south you tend to have more standing death, potentially linked to drought, but we actually don't know for sure. And then in the west you tend to have high mortality rates, but potentially driven by disturbance, by wind mainly. And then in central Amazon you tend to have lower mortality rates, and yeah, and a balance between the standing and broken, and a lot of standing death in central Amazon. Beyond the Amazon, we also want to understand how tree mortality varies across space. And we've been putting together this data to understand global forest dynamics, and this is a big collaboration, trying to understand how mortality varies across space and why. And so we put together this first map of mortality across space, and we use that map to calculate what is the mortality rate that would make the sink stop across different regions across different forests in the globe. We found that 20% increase in mortality would make a fifth of the current sink to stop. So only a 20% that is already being observed in several of that events that I show that show increase in tree mortality would make a lot of the sink stop globally. But at the same time, mortality will need to double. So this is 100% in mortality. Mortality will need to double to stop the sink in 23% of our sampling sites. So that is 36% of the sink currently. So it's still this forest seems to be, some of this forest seems to be quite close to be switched from a sink to a source, but there are quite a few forests globally, and of course we don't have a complete global representation of forests here that are still have quite a big sink comparative to the mortality rates. This is work that is done by a big group of people. Here we only have a few of them, but we are a big team working to understand mortality and dynamics globally. And I just wanted to highlight that this type of work can only be done as a very big collaborative group. That in here we are in a discussion, an event where we were discussing how to work together to improve the way that we do global science. And it's quite a big, long discussion that we tend to have again and again, those who work on these big networks. And one of the outcomes of this meeting was the idea that we need to basically train people and always be invested on training the new generation, particularly from the regions where we have less investment in science and we have less data as well, often available. The next part of the talk, I wanted to focus on the largest tropical trees. So this is a video from the largest angiosperm on record, and it's this big dipterocarp in Borneo, in Malaysia. And these big trees, the 1% biggest trees in the tropics, they store around 50% of all the carbon. And they also are responsible for around 50% of the carbon sink in tropical forests. So these trees are extremely important for the functioning of the systems, but at the same time, we still know very little about them. A few years ago, with my colleague Evan Gora, we set to try to understand what are the main drivers that kill large trees, large tropical trees. So we thought about the different drivers, the biotic, abiotic drivers, and how the importance of these drivers change through size. So in the x-axis here, you have tree size. And what we see is that there's very little evidence of biotic drivers killing very large trees. potentially much harder for a pathogen to kill a very large tree, or herbivores to then wipe out all the leaves of a very large tree. And these big trees are above the canopy, so they're not competing for light anymore. But I want to note that the dashed line means that we don't really have much information. And the reality is that we don't really have enough information about biotic drivers killing these large trees. If you look at abiotic drivers, though, the effect of lightning, wind, water stress tend to increase with size. So of course, as the trees are more exposed in the canopy, they are more exposed to wind, lightning, and potentially also to water stress. But we found that there is very little evidence for what really kills these very, very large trees. And a lot of the literature seems to show that the big trees are more vulnerable to these abiotic stresses. If that's the case, then if you change climate over time, you will tend to kill more and more these very large trees. And there are a few studies, some experiments that have been showing that the large trees seem to be more vulnerable to changes in climate. We then try to use that data, again, the very big network of data across the Amazon, to understand how these trees are doing over time. So we looked at not just the large trees, but we look at tree size over time across the Amazon. And we found that consistently, this was work developed in collaboration with Becky Bunbury Morgan, we found that consistently across the Amazon, tree size has been increasing. And not just tree size has been increasing, but also the distribution of sizes is shifting towards more large trees across the basin. So you tend to have the biggest trees growing more. The median tree size is also increasing. And if you look at here, this is a histogram of each of the sites and how it has changed over time. You see that an increase in the very small ones, but also a big increase in the size of the big ones. So the large trees that were supposed to be more vulnerable and have increasing mortality rates and be suffering from climate change, in our data, in this type of data, we don't find that effect. We find actually the big trees are doing better. So these large trees are gaining, but also the small trees are also benefiting too. And we hypothesize that this might be an effect of increasing CO2 fertilization across the Amazon, benefiting both the very large trees and also the understory trees too. So we looked at how the trees are growing, but actually we have very limited information about the mortality of these large trees. And these large trees, they have a big effect on mortality rates. So this is if you look at mortality rates in percentage of trees per year, and this is the effect on biomass loss. So how much each percent of mortality rate in terms of number of trees change in terms of biomass of the system. And if you look at the very small ones, the 1 to 10 centimeter diameter, you increase mortality rates and you have almost no impact on biomass loss. If you look at the bigger trees, so the 10 to 50 centimeters, their mortality rate in terms of stems will increase biomass loss. But this is almost dwarfed by the increase in mortality rate, in carbon loss that happened when you increase mortality rates of these big trees. So if you change the rates of mortality that we've seen that for the Amazon, this mortality has been changing. The effect on carbon losses for these large trees, caused by these large trees, it's very big. So we then try to look at how good are we at measuring mortality of large trees. So this is a simulation of estimation of mortality rates based on different sites across the tropics. If you have a 1 hectare plot. So if you have a 1 hectare plot, this is the rate that you get for large trees. This is in the log scale in the x-axis. And the error is massive, meaning that you can almost not measure mortality rates for these big trees with 1 hectare. If you increase sample sizes to 50 hectares, then you start getting better estimations of rates. And this is not the changes, it's just looking at rates. But still, the error is very big. If you think of this as an log scale, you cannot really tell, you cannot really say much about the mortality of these big trees. Then if we push this forward and you think about 1,500 hectares. So we talk, what if we measure 1,500 hectares? Then you can get good estimations of mortality for large trees. So thinking of estimating mortality of these very large trees that are so important for the forest and has such a and mortality having such a big impact in the biomass and the functioning of this forest, we proposed this project that is called Gigante, that is quantifying and upscaling the causes and drivers of that tree for giant tropical trees. And this is a big collaborative project funded by NERC and NSF and based across the tropics, where what we do is that we fly a drone over an area of 1,500 hectares in different sites in the tropics. And we fly that drone monthly, trying to detect mortality events. And then after these mortality events are detected, we have a team that hikes to these sites every month, and they get to the mortality event between 1 to 7 weeks of the damage event. So they can then quantify turnover, but also we can then also see what potentially caused the mortality. So if you arrive to the site where mortality happened very quickly, you can see signs of, for instance, this tree that still have healthy roots and it had healthy leaves there. So likely it died from a windstorm, and it was healthy otherwise. But I also can see signs of potentially some mortality killed by wind, by lightning is quite easy to detect as well. And then drought, we can look at a combination of the climate within that window or following that or previously of that window. It's harder to then associate biotic mortality to biotic death to these mortality events, but we are looking at ways of doing that too. So we can quantify how many of these trees are dying, so they quantify the turnover of these big trees, but also identify mechanisms. And we are doing that across 5 sites in the tropics, and we just started. Well, we started the project quite a long time ago now, 3 years ago, and it has been a massive effort to implement the sites, and we have a team in each of the sites running, and I really want to acknowledge this team because they are working every month, going to the forest, measuring these mortality events, and it's a massive logistic challenge to keep the sites running. And now we are moving from the sites that we were only looking at dynamics and trying to understand mortality of large trees. We started a collaboration with Adriane Muelbert from the University of Montreal and the Quebec AI Institute, and also Helena Miller-Landau from Smithsonian, to then change the way that we do this this project and also look at diversity. So there are a few steps that the team from the AI experts helped us with in this project. First, one of them was developing a way to segment the crowns. So now we have the crown segmented, so we know which tree is which we didn't know before. And here is an example of segmentation, and then you can highlight only the big ones, so we can focus on specific trees when we are estimating our rates as well of mortality. But also we are using ways to segment. Well, this is a project that we're calling Segment Any Tree Through Time. So it's following the same tree over time and allowing us to understand when that tree stopped being alive, or phenological changes as well. And our next step is to use a drone that goes very quickly, very close to the canopy, so 6 meters above the canopy. It takes a zoom-in photo of the canopy of different trees, and then in collaboration with colleagues from PlantNet and using the PlantNet algorithm together with what has been developed by the team in Montreal, we can then start identifying the species. Of course, this is the type of photo that you get, so resolution is really good, And the idea is that botanists will then look at these photos and identify the species, and that will feed into the PlantNet model that will then identify species. And hopefully, this is Labelbox, which is the platform that is used to identify the species by the botanists. But hopefully, we can get to converting these gigantic sites, which is the sites of our project, into landscape scale forest dynamics plots. This is the vision anyway. We are working towards that. It's a very big collaborative project that we are pushing and trying to do it in many sites. It's quite advanced now for BCI in Panama. And we are starting to implement this in Duque Reserve in Manaus as well. But we think that this creates new opportunities of understanding forests. So moving from a 1 hectare site to landscapes, the questions that you can ask and the pattern, the patterns that we observe in 1 hectare plot, would they reflect what you see in the landscape? Are the drivers of community structure or diversity the same? So there are many questions that we can ask. And we started at looking through the lenses of these giant trees, but we think that there is a lot of things that a lot of opportunities that this opens. And we really feel that we are creating also infrastructure for others to develop studies using these sites eventually in the future. That these monthly photos also provide a lot of information from phenology, fruiting, leaf phenology, fruiting, and other information as well. So I just want to go back to that spiral and try to then frame the talk within that spiral of work that reconnects. So the idea is that you look at a system and you understand. You give gratitude to the system, so we have like all there in terms of gratitude. You acknowledge crisis, then you create fast perspectives from your understanding of the system, and then we move forward. So I try to think of our research now as something that is evolving and trying to always provide fresh perspectives that can allow us to move forward. And I want to acknowledge this group of artists that is the Walking Forest group. And here we are doing this exercise in the end of the Membra project, trying to understand what are the fresh perspectives and how we moved forward. But just to conclude, so I think we know that forests are changing and tree mortality is increasing. The system is surviving beyond what they have been adapted to, and forests are close to switching from a carbon sink to a carbon source. But at the same time, these forests are quite resilient, and these changes are concentrated potentially in a few regions. We don't know yet exactly how pervasive are the changes. We have signs of these changes everywhere, but how catastrophic these changes are in different areas is something that I think we should still explore more. We have signs of community level adaptation. We know much less about organism adaptation, I would say. And we have tree size increasing in the Amazon, so we still have some resilience in the system that you have not seen, at least when you look at a tree growth, a tree size, that the effect of climate change as strong as we would expect. And I do like to think of ecology for change. So always working as a collective, that we can then have a greater transformative power. We can use tools, like we can use information like the biogeography of trees to inform conservation and restoration. We can use new technologies also to monitor biodiversity and potentially allow communities to monitor biodiversity too. And I feel that integrating art and science can provoke change in others, but also in us scientists, that allow us to see our science in a different way and reflect on how we can then produce change with the knowledge that we gain. I just want to finish with acknowledging this big team. There is not everyone here, but I always work as a big group, and I'm the one speaking here. But of course, this is not my work; it's the work of a big group of people that I'm very privileged to work with. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriane. That was fascinating. We have time for questions, or I can start. Okay. This is just for the Zoom audience. Okay.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. Lots of information to digest there. One thing I was wondering about was the pests and pathogens, and something we've seen in Europe is a number of pests and pathogens expanding their range. So 25 years ago, spruce bark beetle was not a problem in Great Britain, and now it's established in the southeast. Have you seen any similar expansion or new pests, pathogens coming in Amazonia?
That's a very good question. As far as I'm aware, the answer is no. But also, I don't think we have a system to monitor it well enough. And there are a few reasons why I think we don't see it. One of the hypotheses is that you have such a big diversity that if a pathogen would affect one species, that species is likely to be a rare species because we have more rare species than common species. And then maybe we see a big mortality of that species, but we wouldn't be able to detect it because we don't have a sample size big enough to see that. We would see if it was with a very common species that are then everywhere and very abundant, then we would see something. But so far we haven't seen it yet. It might be that because of the system is more diverse, that in a way avoid the spread of the pathogen itself. But yeah, the answer is not no, but I would love to understand more about the pathogens in tropical systems, and I think we do have to study them more in natural systems.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Adriane. In your approach to trying to do the post-mortem on the trees, how easy is it to sometimes tell? It's often quite a challenge to work out whether a tree died and then got a fungus infection or vice versa.
So it's not easy. We developed a protocol to kind of try to unpick what are the potential drivers. And often, as you know, there is this idea of the spiral of death. There are many different drivers that are accumulating over time, and then eventually the tree dies from a final driver. So what we were focusing is on the final driver because we won't be able to see all that accumulation. And what helps is arriving very soon after the death. So we are arriving there a few weeks after the tree died, before it has been taken over by beetles or fungi. So that's one way of doing. We can separate the major drivers. So if it's wind, we also, of course, there is a combination of wind and lianas. So we try to get as many of the risk factors as possible to then afterwards see what is involved to the tree that tree that died. If you arrive very, very soon after the death, you can tell apart whether it's like only wind, potentially only lightning, and then some tree that was already decomposed a lot. So it has the kind of signs that the tree was decaying before it died from wind, for instance. But yeah, we have the proximate cause of death. That's what we call it. And then we have the risk factors that will allow us to then do analysis later and see what could potentially be connected to that.
Tom, okay, I'll ask later. Can I ask just because? Okay. I have a question about the disturbance dynamics, thinking the carbon source versus carbon sink. In a fire-sensitive system like the Amazon, it's somewhat more straightforward to link, for example, fire to eventual mortality, even if it's delayed mortality. But when you were showing forests in California, for example, do you have a way to incorporate these changes or mortalities that are expected and part of the system, that you would have a fire, you would have mortality, but then eventually that would recover? How do you incorporate that expected mortality or mortality that is somewhat part of a healthy system?
So the answer for that work that we are doing now, looking at the global patterns of mortality, we don't really project what is happening in the system or not. We just measure what we see in a few cycles of census. In the US, for instance, they have great coverage of forest inventories across the country. So we have enough samples to tell. We don't look at drivers. We look at just the rates. Drivers is a separate issue that it's much more challenging to look at, but we're looking just at the rates. And so we're not distinguish between fire or not, but we capture that with the data, and then we can estimate what's the rate of mortality expected for that site, for that area.
Hi, yeah, I'm part of a project in French Guiana, and when I visited last year, I saw an area where a whole load of trees, maybe like 10, 20 trees had died in one go, and people said that it was something they were seeing more and more. And I wondered if you see that a lot, and if you have an explanation for what that's about, or kind of a whole kind of clearing with lots of standing dead trees. Yeah.
So one explanation, well, standing death often is, well, it could have three main causes, I would say. So it could be a disease, we don't know. It could be a drought, potentially, depending on if it's in a different, if it's an area more water depleted, potentially. And a third one, it's potentially lightning. So lightning hits a focal tree, and then that tree spreads the current. As long as the branches are close enough, the branches around the tree are close enough to the focal tree, that the lightning current can actually spread through quite a few trees. So like 20 trees would not be unusual. Yeah.
Hi there, thank you. This is a question from online from Angel Rica. It says, thank you for the presentation. I'm from Indonesia, which also has very high tropical forest biodiversity. Do you think the high diversity in countries like Indonesia could make pathogen impacts harder to detect, especially because many species are rare and not monitored closely?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. Yeah, as I mentioned before, that potentially it could be harder to detect, but also, yeah, it could be harder for the pathogen to spread if the next individual of that tree, it's a few hectares away or a few kilometers away as well.
Can I ask something about a tipping point for the Amazon? How do you feel about it?
I think I really like the approach put forward by Paulo Brando, I think it's 2024, of the idea that we might, well, first of all, I do think that the tipping point, it's a hypothesis and one that we don't want to test, whether it actually tips or whether it's kind of this accumulation of stressors without necessarily a feedback loop that would put the system into a complete different, take the system to a complete different state. So I like the idea that I like to think that we have this combination of stressors and you can alleviate some. And I think we have evidence for this combination of stressors causing change, and one stressor on its own not necessarily doing that. And potentially we could alleviate that pressure and make the system still recover. But yeah, that's how I like to think anyway.
Thank you. Any more questions? Do you have more questions online, Steve? No? You do?
Yeah. So 2 questions online. I'll give you the first one. So how is natural forest land converted into oil palm agricultural land irresponsibly? Is this considered forest mortality? What is your response, and what solutions do you suggest or innovations that we need?
It could be considered tree mortality if we think about, yes, when the trees are killed by humans, also it's considered tree mortality. It's not what we are looking at in the Amazon. We look at mostly intact forest. So all the work that I was showing across the Amazon is intact forest. And as for changes in the landscape, there happen kind of quite vast changes in the landscape, as I showed deforestation in the Amazon for cattle range or soybean. This oil palm plantations have massive impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. Within the oil palm itself, it's a completely different system, completely low biodiversity, but then also impacting the remaining forest. So the solution is political and not our solution a solution I can bring. So I think we need to keep advocating for it. That's
Yeah, definitely. And the last one is a political question as well, which is just about, is how political is the Amazon, and the status of Brazil and its wealth if the Amazon was used more effectively, and whether you have any reflections on that. Kind of, that might be out of side of this talk, but yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it is, for as any other system, they are maintained by policies and conservation policies and by people who decide on what to do with a system or not. And I think I forgot the last part of the question, but but so it is very political, and I think more and more Brazilians are realizing, and I can only speak for Brazilians, not for other countries, the importance of Amazonia. We're still far from actually valuing as much as we should, and people who live outside of the Amazon region, I don't think know and value the Amazon as much as we should. And but I don't know, I like to be very hopeful that people will value these systems more and more as we see the changes they can make, as we see how destruction to the system can cause changes to the rest of Brazil. That was in the fires in 2019, when the smoke finally reached São Paulo, when people started having discussions about where the fire smoke from the Amazon reached São Paulo, people start having discussions about the Amazon itself. So I think, unfortunately, it might take it might take a big impact for people to understand and preserve. And I think we are on that path. I like to think that, but at the same time, last week or this week in Brazil, we just approved policies, put forward policies that are very, that would potentially cause massive changes to Amazonia. So policies related to monitoring of deforestation, and also what people can do after land is, deforestation is found. So I think maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I prefer to be hopeful and think that we are going in the right direction. The more we talk about it and the more we try to talk to people outside academia, potentially we can help that.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriane. I think if we don't have more questions, we can go maybe for drinks in Atmosphere Room and then continue more informal conversations with Adriane. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you again, Adriane. This was awesome. Obrigada, Adriane. Arrasou. Obrigada. Indiquei, Felipe.